Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is a short story called Office. If I was unwell yet came into work, I was irresponsible and martyring myself to impress management. If I was unwell and stayed at home, I was taking advantage and callously leaving overstretched others to do my work. If I brought leftovers in to heat up for lunch, I was stinking the place out, pretentious and irritating. If I brought sandwiches, the bread would make me fat. If I purchased sandwiches from the trolley or snack van, I was lazy and obsessed with chatting up the warehouse men who also bought their lunches there. When I got pregnant, I was using and abusing the system. I wasn't. I hadn't been there long enough to reap any benefit. When I chatted to a long-haired rocker from the warehouse, I was a slut. When I sat alone at lunch, it was because I was stuck up and thought I was better than them all. When I sat with others, they were keeping me company only to laugh at me behind their hands. When I took advantage of the company's subsidised French classes, I was considered too big for my breeches. When I proved successful in my work, it was clearly a result of having slept with the boss. When I struggled with minor elements of my work, this was proof I should never have been appointed. That's how it was with the office bullies. The stronghold office windows were positioned far too high to offer a view, and were also thoroughly ineffectual at keeping the atmosphere light, cool or airy. These being the main functions of windows, the existence of this glazing was futile. What a place to work it was! Sterile 1970s concrete prefab slabs had been fashioned into a warehouse and associated office. It was hot and horrible, bland and bitchy. I'll call the bully ladies Pauline and Carolyn. Pauline was skinny and close to retirement, and her long sour face sprouted short, spiky grey hair. She was bitter and belligerent and represented the rough, raw side of town. Carolyn was average height-wise, but rather larger girth-wise. She had one of those piggy faces that looked worse with makeup than without, and she was as hard as nails. She would glare at me when my boss wasn't in the room, and I could feel her looks burning into me, laser-like and intimidating. One day I drove to work as usual. I was in the extreme nauseous early stages of pregnancy with my first baby, but otherwise felt well. At the time I was living 20 miles from work at the edge of the countryside and would commute to town along jam-packed motorways. On that day, when I was moving towards my turn-off, I passed out at the wheel and woke up on the hard shoulder against the crash barrier. Fortunately, I had been travelling fairly slowly as I was about to leave the motorway. I recovered a little, ate part of my packed lunch, drove to the slip road on the hard shoulder, and eventually proceeded to work. I phoned the doctor for an appointment and continued to work for the rest of the day. I told my boss what had occurred, but the bitter nastiness of Carolyn and Pauline totally counterbalanced any support he gave. The following day my doctor signed me off for 6 weeks, telling me I had dangerously low blood pressure. I phoned my boss to explain. Pauline and Carolyn, I was later told, had eavesdropped on our conversation and expressed both disgust and disbelief that I was ill. I never returned to Stronghold, though my boss did visit my home a few times to ensure all paperwork and obligations had been dealt with. He opened up a little too, and I discovered that Carolyn had been offended when I had been appointed, as she felt my job should have been hers. However, management had not considered her capable of the challenging technical role and had looked for an external applicant. So this was why I'd spent weeks being intimidated, hurt, bitched about and sniggered about. This was why new rumours were being spread about my sexual fidelity, my fake qualifications, the inadequacy of my transport, the poshness of my voice, and so on. Preposterous emails would appear in my inbox with startling regularity, and their origins were now clear. But another thing I discovered was that I was not alone. Pauline and Carol's bullying of Olga stopped the day that I started work in their office, and before Olga there had been others. Perhaps it was the physical atmosphere of the place, sick office syndrome. Perhaps that was why it happened. Perhaps it was my personality and the personalities of all the other collective victims, or Pauline and Carolyn's fears of a non-local colleague. After all, I wasn't born in the same place and hadn't walked the same streets as they had. I didn't have the same particular brand of northern accent. Perhaps I and the other victims were to be feared as a result. Or perhaps it was those two middle-aged women who just enjoyed hurting a person when she was down. I don't know. I think the latter. No matter how simpering these women were to those they wished to impress, enough of us were aware that this was a facade. These despots, these know-it-alls, were almost impossible to escape from. I had been trapped until ill health took any decisions out of my hands. Workplace bullies. Every second in their vicinity lunges by so slowly. 60 minutes an hour, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And do you know what made it worse? They'd made their decision that I was their next victim even before my first day of working there. It had been overheard. They would make life impossible for me, so I would leave and Carolyn would be offered the position. Their behaviour wasn't even anything to do with me. They'd have bullied and intimidated anyone who didn't meet with their specific approval. Do you know, I would have preferred it to be personal. At least it would have given me something to fight against.